Amen. Amen. John chapter 1, of course, tells us about Philip really and his conversion, but in terms of a text that sums up, I believe, the life of Philip, you really find this kind of cynical or calculated thought or perspective of his come out in John chapter 6. And in John chapter 6, where we have the feeding of the 5,000, we read that Philip, he answered Jesus Christ, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. If you look into history, you'll find that it is full of what I would call grade A cynics. People who look at the facts, look at the figures, have it all lined up. They need to know every piece of detail, all of the information, and then they come to a logical conclusion that venture, that project, that plan, it could never be accomplished. Take, for example, Charles H. Jewell. He was the U.S. Patent Officer in 1899. He said this: everything that can be invented has already been invented. Imagine saying that 100 or so years ago. In 1797, the first successfully constructed cast iron plough was rejected by farmers in New Jersey because they believed that cast iron would pollute the land and poison the land. One politician in the United States also declared that the introduction of the railroad system would lead to the building of many insane asylums because people just wouldn't be able to cope with the sight of a very, very quick locomotive going through the countryside. That's what a politician said whenever the first railroad was built. Experts also suppose that if trains travelled at over 30 miles an hour, passengers would suffocate. Whenever exploring the idea of converting ships from wood to iron, engineers initially rejected the idea, believing that iron ships could not float. So as I've said, the world has been and always will unfortunately be full of cynics, grade A cynics, people who look at all of the facts, look at all of the figures, and in spite of that, still come to the conclusion, well, there's no point in doing it because it just cannot be done. And that was the type of person that Philip was. He was a grade A cynic. His glass always seems to be half empty. His glass was never half full. He was very much a facts and a figures man. Philip, he needed to have all of the pros and all of the cons of something before weighing them up and coming to his own conclusion. Now, at the same time, there's nothing wrong with that per se. It is good to be logical. It's good to think through things. God gives us not merely a heart, but he also gives us a mind to use for his glory. But at the same time, when you're that kind of an individual, where it descends into you always walking by sight, and you never walk by faith, well then, when you have such an attitude, you're actually being robbed of being useful and being a blessing to the Lord. If it makes you an overly careful and overly cautious individual, needlessly cautious, then you're actually robbed of knowing the joy of at times launching out in faith with the Lord if you never exercise faith. Now, what do we know about Philip? Well, from the list of the disciples, as I've said, Philip, he appears in the second group. But he always appears first in that second group. That second group also comprises of Bartholomew or Nathaniel, Thomas, and Matthew, as well as Philip. We also find out in the Bible that he is from the city of Bethsaida. In John chapter 1, he is described as from the city of Bethsaida, which from our studies we have already learned that Andrew and Peter were from as well. So he's from the same city as Andrew and Peter and probably knew them very well prior to his conversion. And so here was an individual who did become a Christian, did become a disciple, did become a follower of Jesus Christ. He was, in a sense, a very practically minded individual. And he was very useful to the Lord. But at times that lack of faith, at times that overly cautious side to him, it held him back. It held him back from true usefulness in the cause of Jesus Christ. And yes, beloved, there is a time to be careful. And there is a time to be calculated. Sometimes that's necessary. But there are other times when being overly cautious and overly careful and overly calculated, it can actually be an obstacle. Because what it does is, if you weigh up a situation, you weigh up a project, you weigh up something in your mind, and you just think, well, there's too much to do, too many challenges, and you never exercise faith, then you'll never grow in faith. If you're never exercising something, it will never develop, it will never grow. Now, we must also be mindful of the fact that we are all different. God has created and constituted us, He has created and constituted you to be different to everybody else. And naturally speaking, in the body of Christ, some will be more visionary. Some will exercise faith in a sense more than others. Some will just be that way disposed. Others will be more calculated and wise. And at times, both are necessary. But there are other times when a lack of faith is wrong. And as I've said, it can hold you back from being a blessing. And there were times in Philip's life that was the case. So I want to think today about Philip, the disciple. In John chapter 1, we see firstly his conversion, and we see that in John 1, verse 43 and 44. There we read, "The day following, Jesus would go forth into Galilee, and findeth Philip, and saith unto him, Follow me. Now Philip was of Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter." As I remarked previously in previous studies, John chapter 1 is a crucial chapter in terms of the conversion of the disciples. Here you read of the conversion of at least 5 disciples. We've seen that already in our studies. John, Peter, Andrew, as well as Philip, and we'll see next week, Nathanael. But wonderfully in John chapter 1, their conversion experiences of these disciples, they're different. They're different. But one of the things that marks out Philip's conversion is that he is the only person in John chapter 1 that is not won through personal evangelism, but rather he is won by solely Jesus Christ speaking to him and being face to face with him. If you read carefully, and we've thought about this already, but if you look very carefully at John chapter 1, you'll see everybody else in John chapter 1, the other 4 disciples, they were won through personal evangelism. Even think of Andrew. Although Andrew was face to face with Christ in a sense, yet he was firstly pointed to Christ in John 1:29 through John the Baptist. John the Baptist, he simply pointed, "Behold the Lamb of God which takes away the sin of the world." Andrew and John heard the preaching of John the Baptist first before being confronted by Jesus Christ. Of course, then Peter was won through personal evangelism and others as well. So they were all won to Christ through the influence of another, all except this skeptic, Philip. Verse 43, the day after, Jesus is with Andrew and so on. Verse 43, the next day, it simply states, Jesus went forth to Galilee, findeth Philip, and said unto him, Philip, follow me. So it seems Jesus Christ, after being with these other disciples, he purposes. Just look at it carefully again. He would go forth, verse 43, and findeth Philip. He desires, he wills to go forth and finds Philip. And the verb find in the Greek, it's very, very strong. It has the idea of searching for something until you find it, obviously. You leave no stone unturned until you find that individual, that thing. So what you see here is this, is Jesus Christ, he purposed to go into Bethsaida, a little village just in the northwest of Galilee. He would go. He wanted, he desired, he willed to go to Bethsaida. And whenever he got there, he findeth Philip. In other words, he went to Bethsaida to find Philip. And whenever he found Philip, he simply said, Philip, follow me. The idea really, in the Greek, it just means serve me. Rise up and serve me. It's the same word for deacon. Rise up, follow me, and serve me. Give to me your everything. So here we see the conversion of this skeptic. He wasn't won through personal evangelism. No. How was he won to Jesus Christ? Very simply, Jesus Christ himself purposed to go to where he was, his own city, his own town as it were. And he met him, whenever he was doing, he met him and simply said, he faced him up and said, Philip, rise up and follow me. And this, in a sense, is how Jesus Christ saves you. He purposes to find you. And when he finds you, as it were, he simply says to you, follow me. Follow me. And perhaps you have found this of recent days, those who are not Christians here this morning. Over recent days, you've found that no matter where you've been, over the last few weeks, maybe months, that it's as if Christ is just hounding you down. He's doing exactly with you what he did with Philip. He findeth Philip. He's going to where you are. He's meeting you where you're at. Whether it be your workplace, whether it be the home. It seems as though this is how Jesus Christ deals with individuals. He finds them and then he simply says to them, follow me. Well, that Christ would do that with you today. Having found you, that as Philip, as he just rose up, as it seems, and just followed Jesus Christ. It was enough for this grade A cynic, for Jesus Christ to come face to face to him and say, follow me, serve me, give to me everything. And so it should be with you. Jesus Christ, he simply says, follow me personally, where you're at, your street, your school, your job. He comes to you where you're at, and he simply says, follow me. Are you following him? Have you heard that personal, effectual call of Jesus Christ? You know, Paul heard it. The Apostle Paul. And writing to the church at Philippi, he said this in Philippians 3, verse 12, just recounting his own experience. I follow after, if that I may apprehend, now listen to this, that for which also I am apprehended of Jesus Christ. So he speaks here in Philippians 3:12 of being apprehended of Jesus Christ. You apprehend someone, you seize them. You read of newspaper and see court proceedings, etc. So-and-so, they were apprehended and they were taken away. They were just lifted, essentially. They were seized, and that's the thought of the word there in the Greek. It seems that Paul, he describes his own conversion experience as being apprehended by Jesus Christ. He was seized by Christ. Of course, that's what happened in a spiritual sense, isn't it? Whenever he was on the Damascus Road, Christ stopped him, seized him, and saved him. Have you been apprehended today, in a spiritual sense? Has Christ apprehended you? Has he won your heart, and are you following him? You know, from God's perspective, verse 43 tells us that Christ findeth Philip. But you know, a few verses later, whenever Philip was testifying then to Nathanael, we'll look at this greater detail next week. How did Philip put it to Nathanael? We have found him. I found Christ. And it was the same with Andrew, wasn't it? When he went and he evangelized and he gave his brother his testimony, we have found him. So what you see here is the two different perspectives of salvation when someone becomes a Christian. From God's perspective, he sends Jesus Christ to find them, to seek and save that which is lost. But you know full well from your own experience, how do you put it? How do you recount it? I found him. The two are not conflicting in a sense. Because in your experience, you have found him. You've been lurking, you've been searching, you have found him. But from God's perspective, he sends Christ to save you. This was the conversion experience of Philip. Notice then, secondly, not merely his conversion, but then his calculation. His calculation. Now we see this in John chapter 6 and verse 7, where we have the feeding of the 5,000. John chapter 6, verse 7, we read, Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient, that every one of them may take a little. Now at this stage, Jesus has done other miracles. He's turned the water into wine, for example, and the disciples would have seen him do other miracles. And now here's a huge crowd, 20,000 people. They're in the desert, they're following Jesus Christ, and they are hungry. And in verse 5 of John 6, it's Christ that says to Philip, no other gospel account give us this detail, but John does. Christ says to Philip, when shall we buy bread that these may eat? He could have asked any of the 12, where are we going to find bread? But he zoned in on Philip. He zoned in on Philip. Why did he do this? Verse 6 tells us, to prove Philip, to test Philip. See, Christ knows everything. He knows everything about us. And he knows Philip, and he knows he's a skeptical, cynical kind of an individual. Now, Philip is a Christian at this stage. We've already seen that in John chapter 1. So what is Jesus Christ doing here? He singles out Philip to prove him, to test him, to put him to the test. He knows, you see, that he is skeptical, that he perhaps will doubt. And so he's doing this to prove him. And Philip, what does he do? Well, they all count what they have. They only have 200 penny worth of bread. That's not sufficient. 200 penny worth. A penny was about a day's wages, so a couple of hundred loaves of bread, that's not going to feed 15,000 people. How should Philip have responded? Well, Philip was walking in faith. Philip should have perhaps answered something along this line whenever Christ proved him. Lord, you made the wine at Cana. You fed your children in the wilderness with manna. You have the power then to deal with this. I maybe don't know how you're going to deal with it, but Lord, you've worked in the past. You have miracles. Do something, Lord. But he simply says, he gets his little calculator out. 200 penny worth of bread is not sufficient to feed 15 or 20,000 people. In a sense, he's right. He's doing the logical thing. But there's no faith here. And his lack of faith in this instance, and in other instances as well, as we're going to see, but in this particular instance, his lack of faith, it actually robs him of being a blessing, of proving Jesus Christ. And all the while, now he's not really sure of this, but all the while, Christ is proving him. Christ is testing him. Oh, it's not Satan here. It's not. So, sometimes Satan tests you, and he tempts you. But Christ also tests his people, and he tempts his people. And he's testing Philip here. He puts Philip to the test, and unfortunately, Philip fails the test. Philip, I'm stretching your faith here. I'm stretching it. I want to hear something from you. I want to see, have you developed any since you've become a Christian? Are you trusting me more? But Philip, he fails the test. You see, faith is not merely necessary for salvation. It's also necessary for your sanctification. It's necessary for your growth and progress as a Christian. It's absolutely necessary. Why is it perhaps that you didn't grow the way you wanted to in 2021? Were you exercising faith enough? That's a challenge. It's a challenge to us all. Challenge to us congregationally, challenge to you as an individual. Never lose sight of the fact that at times Christ tests you. He tests you. He puts you to the test. And he's putting you to the test, why? Well, like anybody tests you, to see how you're going to respond, to see how you're going to fare. Now, he doesn't necessarily come along and say, well, here's a test for you. But all the while, he is testing you. Maybe you found that last year. Don't just see things as chance or whatever will be, fate. It's just secularism. If you're going through a difficult time, make no mistake about it, beloved. It's either Christ putting you to the test, or else it is God permitting Satan, as he did with Job, to tempt you. It's one or the other. It's one or the other. And ultimately, when you think about it, it's God then. God, he always is over our tests. Just remember that. You think of the two blind men in Matthew chapter 9. They asked Jesus Christ for mercy. They're just outside the house of Jairus. And in Matthew 9:28, Jesus says to them, "Believe ye that I am able to do this?" They want to see. They said to him, "Yea, Lord." Then he touched their eyes and saying, "According to your faith be it unto you." In that instant, why did Christ touch the eyes of those two blind men? Because they believed that he was able to make them see. Very simply. Yes, in a sense, it was through the mercy of Christ. It was through his intervention. But at the same time, Jesus, he makes it clear, it was because they had exercised faith and they believed that he was able to just touch their eyes and make them see. So God does reward your faith. But he also sees those times when perhaps you haven't exercised faith as you should have. You know, a group of church leaders, this was in America, they got together and they were discussing the need for a new church building. Attendances had grown. The little building this church was meeting in was overflowing every Sunday. As they looked at their accounts, they were comfortably meeting bills, and the committee voted on a new church. They were unanimous, all but one man. This man said this, "Gentlemen, where shall we get the money? We do not have a large building fund. Should we not wait until we have most of the money in the bank? Let's not move too fast." And because of that one individual's contribution, The discussion, it rolled on for another load of months. It was put back. They wanted to be unanimous, but they weren't unanimous. 3 years later, not merely had the committee stepped out in faith, but all of the bills were easily met. And they were meeting in a new church building. That happened in America. I know the similarities between ourselves here and so on, but we're just using that as an example. We're just using that as an example that sometimes a lack of faith can hold you back and even hold a body back as well. His conversion is calculation, but also I want you to think of Philip's confusion here. His confusion. We didn't read it for sake of time, but in John chapter 12 we see a time in Philip's life when Philip was confused. Now it's a well-known setting. John chapter 12, the Greeks, it's the feast of Passover, it's leading up to the death of Jesus Christ. And in John chapter 12 there are Greeks and they come to the disciples, they want to see Jesus. Sirs, we would see Jesus. John 12, 21 and 22, the same came therefore to Philip, which was of Bethsaida of Galilee, and desired him, saying, Sir, we would see Jesus. Philip cometh and telleth Andrew, and Andrew again Philip tell Jesus. So here are Greeks. They're fed up with dead religion. Fed up with Judaism. They've converted to Judaism, but it seems they want more. They want to see Jesus. They want to see Jesus Christ. This is a good appetite. This is a good desire. But it's very, very interesting that when they want to see Christ, they want to behold Jesus Christ, they want to speak with Jesus Christ, who do they come to? They come to Philip. Now, why did they come to Philip? Well, as I have said, Philip was from Bethsaida. Bethsaida was just 10 miles from the border between Israel and Phoenicia. Phoenicia was a Gentile pagan region. And so what I want you to simply see is that Philip, to put it into our language, Philip was from a border town or border city. Philip would have got on, to put it in our language, he would have got on better with those who were pagan, who were Gentile. James and Peter perhaps weren't the best individuals to send. Maybe it was these individuals, they had seen Peter, they had heard what James was like. Quite rough, quite tough, rough around the edges. Philip perhaps was a little bit more quiet, a little bit more reserved, and so they just feel more comfortable speaking with Philip than perhaps with Peter and James. And here's just a simple lesson before I go on. Sometimes people, they give you the excuse that I'm too quiet, I'm too reserved, and so I can't do anything. I don't like to be up at the front in the public eye, in the public demeanour. Here is Philip, he is quieter, and he is actually chosen. He is chosen to speak to these individuals. These individuals want to speak to Philip because he is of that nature. They don't want to speak to those who are publicly used, Peter and James, because whilst they're good men, they're not perfect. No, they feel much more comfortable speaking with this quieter disciple. There's a work for us all to do. Whether we be extrovert, whether we be introvert, or somewhere in between, there's a work for us all to do. Just because we're quiet in nature does not exclude us from the service of Jesus Christ. Now here's Philip, and they come to Philip. And they ask him, Philip, we would see Jesus. We want to see Jesus. Philip could have taken them straight to Jesus Christ. And you know, Philip could have had the joy. And this is the point here. Philip could have had the joy of seeing these Greeks, these pagans, who, by the way, want to speak to him anyway. He could have had the joy of pointing them to Jesus Christ and maybe Christ saving them. But Philip didn't. Philip, he just go see Andrew. Go speak to Andrew. Philip cometh, verse 22 of John 12, and telleth Andrew. Now Andrew did the right thing. He went and he told Jesus. Andrew was always introducing people to Jesus. Philip just introduced them to Andrew. Andrew was a good disciple and quiet as well. But Philip did not introduce them just to Jesus Christ himself, because he would have had doubts. For example, when Jesus Christ called them to be disciples, he told them to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And here were Gentiles, here were pagans. They weren't Jews. So maybe he's battling with this in his mind. Christ has called us to minister to Jews primarily. These are non-Jews. These are Gentiles. What am I to do? So you can see the indecision here in his mind. And it has a kind of a halfway house. He just says, well, look, there's Andrew. And Andrew will deal with it. Now, whilst he was indecisive at the same time, Philip and Andrew did both bring them to Christ. So in the end, in the midst of his confusion, in the midst of his indecision, he did bring the matter ultimately to Jesus Christ. But at the same time, the point just here is this, is that I believe that he could have seen these individuals won to Christ himself, but because of his indecision and his confusion, he lost out on the blessing. But he did turn his confusion to Christ at the same time. What a lesson for you today. There are times that your indecision and times that your calculation and your logic and pragmatism, at times it can be a good thing, and it is at times necessary in the work of God. But there are other times it can hold you back. There are other times when being too calculated and being too cold and being too indecisive, it actually robs you from launching out in faith and perhaps even introducing people to Jesus Christ. What a lesson for us all here today. This shows you just how difficult it is to always get things right. It's nigh on impossible. Because there are some, and they will just introduce, it's just they're natural, just in them in a sense. There are others who are more cold, more confused, more indecisive as in a sense. And so we should always seek to aim for the middle, to aim for balance. And ultimately we should always seek to please Jesus Christ. To honour him. To honour him. Are we doing that? We all face tricky decisions. Those in oversight in this congregation, at times we face difficult decisions, but we're all overseers, in a sense. If you're called to lead a family, if you're a husband here, if you're a father here, you're called to lead, you're called to make decisions. And there are times when pragmatism is a good thing. There are other times when it's not such a good thing, and you do just need to ask the Lord for grace then, that you will just be given a measure of faith to do the right thing. Abe Lincoln, when he was talking with a friend during the Civil War, he said, "I have been driven many times to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. My own wisdom and that of all about me seemed insufficient for that day." Often he was driven to his knees by just the need to make wise and good decisions that affected his own life, that affected obviously a nation as well. And so here was Philip, and his indecision robbed him of blessing, but at the same time, he brought it to Christ. He brought his confusion to Christ. Beloved, there are going to be times this year where you're going to be confused. You're not going to know which way to turn. And in those days, if nothing else, yes, Philip ultimately is a good example. Bring the confusion to Jesus Christ. Psalm 55:22, "Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee." So here was Philip, and he was confused. He brought it ultimately to the Lord, brought these men to the Lord. One last thought, his compassion, his closeness, his confusion. Lastly then, his censure. We find a censure in John chapter 14. And in John chapter 14, we have the disciples, they're in the upper room. It's the night really before the death of Jesus Christ. Christ is speaking to his disciples. And in John 14, after telling them about the Father's house and about telling them about the many mansions, we read in John 14, verses 8 and 9 then, "Philip saith to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it sufficeth us. And Jesus said to him, Have I been so long time with you, and yet thou hast not known me, Philip? He that hath seen me hath seen the Father. How sayest thou then, Show us the Father?" So John 14 is a well-known passage of Scripture. Christ is saying, in my Father's house there are many mansions. Speaking about heaven, about it being the Father's house. And Philip is listening on. Remember, Philip has been converted 3 years now. 3 years he's been following Jesus Christ. 3 years he's been a disciple. And Christ is speaking to his disciples about heaven, particularly being the Father's house. And Philip says to him, verse 8, "Show us the Father and it'll be enough for me." Jesus, you're talking to us about the Father's house. If only you just show me the Father, then I'll believe in the Father's house. After 3 years. And that's why Christ censures him. That's why I've called this point a censure. Because Jesus then in verse 9 says, have I been so long time with you, and you've not known me, Philip? Philip, I've been with you for 3 years. Do you not know by now that I am God? That I am the express image of the Father, as he states in Hebrews chapter 1. In other words, when you look at me in the flesh, I am just an image, I am just a revelation of God, because I am God. And so he rebukes Philip, he censures Philip here, because Philip had been converted for 3 years, and Philip should have known this. But as of yet, he's still confused. And so Jesus Christ censures him. And as we bring this to a close this morning, sometimes Philip's censure can be Christ's censure to you. How long have I been with you? What really Christ is saying to Philip is this: you should know this by now, Philip. You should be further along in the journey now, Philip. You've been with me for a long time, Philip. You've learned of me. You should know this, Philip. And this is a challenge here to those who have been on the road, the Christian life, 5, 10, 20, 30 years. The challenge is this, is that we should always be progressing. Christ would perhaps even say to you today, how long have I been with you? And yet you've not known me and you've not known this. If you get to that stage in your Christian life where you think I've arrived, you haven't arrived. You'll never arrive this side of eternity. You never finish school with Jesus Christ. There are never school breaks with Jesus Christ. Christ is always learning. We should always be learning, always be following him more, always learning something about him. The challenge to you this year then, as we bring this to a close, is this, is that maybe you have failed the Lord and you maybe haven't learned of him in 2021. Well, resolve in your heart before you leave here this morning to put that in the past and to, if nothing else, to know more of him in 2022. If there are certain areas in certain books in the Bible you don't understand, then just make a simple note. Look, Lord, I don't know about this particular book. I don't know about this particular period of history in Israel. I'm going to learn, if nothing else, I'm going to set myself and know about it this year. I am going to follow Jesus Christ more this year than I did last year. And that is a good pattern. A good pattern to follow, a good resolution to make. We should all be progressing. Philip had spent 3 years in the very presence of Christ. How long have you known me, Philip? What a challenge to us. And really, if Philip maybe had have known the Lord better, maybe he wouldn't have said this. If he wasn't so calculated and indecisive, then maybe he just wouldn't have said this. But what a challenge today to advance and progress in the knowledge of Christ. So we trust that these few lessons, these simple lessons, will be a benefit, a blessing, and a challenge to you as we walk with the Lord this year.